how to apply to the best med schools for you. It's now the end of February. AACOMAS opens in May. AMCAS opens in June. Yes, the new medical school application cycle is about to begin. It's just around the corner. If you're applying, you're going to be choosing where to apply. How do you make those decisions? What criteria should you use? Frankly, they are critical to your acceptance chances. And I'm going to tell you exactly what you should focus on in this episode of Admission Straight Talk.
Welcome to Admission Straight Talk, the podcast dedicated to graduate admissions and helping you approach the application process thoughtfully and successfully. Your host is Accepted's founder and world-renowned admissions guru, Linda Abraham. At Accepted, our mission is to get you to that unforgettable moment when you read your acceptance email and shout, "Yes, I'm in!" Confident you'll be attending the perfect program to help you launch the career of your dreams.
Welcome to the 353rd episode of Admission Straight Talk. I've decided to do a solo show today and address something that I've been thinking a lot about as this next cycle comes up and as the preceding cycle winds down. I'm so glad you decided to join me for this really important and fundamental show if you're considering or even committed to earning your MD or DO degree. While I will deal today with where to apply, there are lots of other important elements and factors in the medical school application process and that will contribute to a successful medical school application. And I'm sure you have lots of burning questions. So to get answers to your questions, you can do so by joining Accepted Consultants Sydney Foote, Dr. Herman Gordon, and Dr. Barry Rothman on March 12th at Ace Your Med School Applications, a live Q&A with 3 med school experts, which I will moderate, and I'm not one of the 3. The webinar will begin with a short presentation, but most of that hour will be devoted to answering your questions. So register today to reserve your spot at accepted.com/353QA. Again, accepted.com/353QA. And now I'd like to dive into today's topic because it really is the foundation of an effective medical school application. And for the moment, what I'd like you to do is imagine a Venn diagram with 2 circles, only 2, overlapping. One circle you can label schools you want to attend, and the other circle is labeled schools that are likely to want you. The schools where the space rather, where those 2 circles overlap, those are the schools you should apply to. It's that simple. Easy, right? What am I going to spend the next half hour talking about? And indeed, if it was just that simple, this podcast would be over. And taking a 30,000-foot view, it is that simple. But I'd like to unwrap both those ideas and give you suggestions as to what you should consider in selecting the schools you would like to attend and apply to, and also how to research the schools to determine which are those likely to want you. Now, let's also touch on how many schools you should apply to. Here at Accepted, we typically recommend around 20 because individual school acceptance rates are so low, typically under 20%, and in some cases under 10% or even under 5%, especially if you're talking about in-state versus out-of-state, and you're out-of-state and there's a strong preference for one over the other, it can be really, really low. If you apply wisely to around 20 programs, you should have at least 1 and maybe more acceptances come spring. Obviously, you also have to submit impressive primary and secondary applications. It's not just about the choice, it's also about the execution. And you need to interview well. But we're not going to discuss the application itself today. We're going to focus on where to apply. All right, so let's first talk about schools likely to want you. Okay, let's get this out of the way. Yes, the stats count. They do count. Even the feeling in your heart that you're going to make a great physician, that's wonderful. It's important. It's not going to be enough on its own to overcome low stats. So what are low stats? Well, they depend on the school you're applying to. Look at the MSAR. Look at Accepted's selectivity index if you want to do a kind of a real quick and dirty assessment for where you're at in terms of some very basic averages. But I really recommend that you look at the MSAR and medical school application requirements, just to be clear about that, what it stands for. And look at the MCAT and GPA ranges, both the overall numbers, the total numbers, and for GPA, the science average. For MCAT, look at the breakdown of the different parts of the exam. And ideally, you want to be at or above averages across the board for everything for at least 3 to 5 of the schools that you apply to. You should try to be at or above the 25th percentile for most stats at, I would say, roughly half, maybe a little more than half of the schools that you apply to. And that means if you're taking my number of 20, it would be at least 10, maybe 12. And then you can apply to 3 to 5 programs where your stats are perhaps on the weaker side across the board, but I wouldn't say ridiculously weak. I would just say on the weaker side. But you really want to attend and have a strong fit with those programs. And we're going to get into the non-statistical elements, the softer side of the medical school application process in a minute. Your mission is to show that you identify with the school's mission and values, and mission is an important element in the application process. You want to, first of all, read the school's mission statement, and if they have a value statement, read that too, so that you can show that you share those values and that mission in your secondaries and in an interview. You don't have to worry about that so much in the primary application because obviously that's going to all the schools. One way to show fit is to have relevant clinical exposure. So for example, if you are applying to MD programs that have some real strengths in urban areas and urban medicine, then you want to talk about working in an urban soup kitchen, or perhaps volunteering for at-risk kids in an underprivileged area in an urban area. If you are applying to DO programs, you want to be able to have DO exposure, osteopathic medical exposure. Perhaps you shadowed a DO. For some schools, research is going to be really, really important. Have you done research, lab research? Have you been a co-author on a paper or helped present? And then there's the school's approach to medical education. Is it problem-based learning? Is it system-based learning? Is it team-based learning? Is it traditional lecture, which at this point has almost gone the way of the horse and buggy in medical school? When have you enjoyed learning in this way, or can you point to an example or some reason that you think you would really enjoy this approach to med ed? And then there's their strengths and your interests. Where do grads go into residencies? If you're likely to go, that would indicate the school has a strength in that area. And if you are more interested in that area, again, it's something that the school will likely be more interested in with you, and you'll be more interested in with the school. And then there's their values and your values. Is service to the poor a value held by the school? Increasing access to underserved communities? When have you participated perhaps in a medical mission? Is leadership something that the school values? Well, were you president of your sorority or fraternity? Perhaps it's teamwork. Have you been an active member of a team? Maybe you played sports throughout college, either intramural or varsity, or, I'm not a sports fan, so I'm probably not that up on it, or perhaps division sports, which would be really hard with a medical school curriculum. And then there's the in-state versus out-of-state factor. Now, some programs have a strong preference, especially public state universities, for in-state students. In fact, they are required by law to prefer residents of their state. And you can look at Accepted's in-state versus out-of-state tool, and we'll link to it from the show notes at accepted.com/353. And you can see what are the acceptance rates for in-state students versus out-of-state students. Some of the private universities have absolutely no preference. They really couldn't care less where you're from. But again, those public universities, or even universities receiving funds from the state in which they're located, they frequently have a strong preference for in-state applicants. And you can see that in the acceptance stats in our in-state versus out-of-state school. That is an indication of the school's preference. Now, the last element is you want to show that you have something to contribute to the school's class and community. The best way there are a variety of ways that you can show this ability to contribute. It could be that you're going to add a diversity element. Either you're from a group that's underrepresented in medicine in terms of ethnicity, social economic background, or sexual orientation. Perhaps it's an unusual level of achievement. Maybe you've contributed on a very high level to various organizations and communities that you've been a part of in the past. That would indicate to the schools that you'll do so again in the future. And then maybe you've had distinctive experiences. Perhaps you're a musician or an artist, as well as a pre-med. Or maybe you have some very unusual travel experiences, or you're a triathlon, an Ironman athlete, Ironwoman athlete. Maybe those kinds of experiences show, well, the athleticism shows self-discipline, to be sure. They mean that you're going to bring a little bit different perspective to their class, and that would definitely show that you have something to contribute and not just that. So those are the elements that you should research in determining what schools are likely to want you. But and the last one, I guess, is more about what you have to contribute. But still, it's assess your ability to add something to the class, because that's going to be play a factor in their assessment of you and how they're going to look at you. Now, these are the elements, as I said, that are going to determine that you should be researching and determining which schools are likely to want you. But also, you have to be happy wherever you choose to attend. So now I want you to think about the factors that are likely to make you a happier, more satisfied medical student. The schools that have what you're looking for are the ones you should want to attend. They should be in that second circle in the Venn diagram. Okay, so one critical thing that you have to examine really objectively is location. And by location, one element is distance from family. Do you want to be close to family, or do you want to be far from family? Or how far do you want to be from family? Is a 2-hour drive just right? A 1-hour drive, 10 minutes? I mean, that can be an important element. And it's also part of the in-state versus out-of-state equation. Now, again, in terms of your own preferences, in-state could mean higher acceptance rate. It could also mean lower costs, significantly lower costs. If you live in a state with a state medical school, you may enjoy that higher acceptance rate that I discussed a minute ago and lower in-state tuition. In other words, that school that's in your state may not only be easier to get into for you, but it may mean a less expensive medical education and lower debt when you get out, which could be a big deal. Both are major advantages and mean that you should probably apply to most, if not all, in-state schools, unless you are really convinced that you're going to be miserable there. Then I don't think it makes sense to even try. Another factor that is important for some, and you have to decide if it's important to you, is weather. How do you feel about snow and ice? If you hate it, well, the Mayo probably isn't for you, the Mayo Clinic. Neither probably is Harvard. Or perhaps you don't like heat and humidity. Then maybe the University of Florida or Tulane shouldn't be on your list. Do you want an urban campus or a rural one? Do the canyons of Manhattan compel or repel? Does the quieter pace of rural living call your name? Then check out med schools either in college towns or in smaller cities. I already touched on cost, and I'm going to touch on it again. There is the in-state versus out-of-state and the lower tuition offered by many public in-state medical schools, public universities. But there's also the issue of cost of living. So if you can live at home, obviously you save a ton of money on rent. And that would be both if you can live at home in terms of geography and in terms of just inter-family dynamics. But cost of living in the particular area in which you live can make an enormous difference in the amount of debt that you end up with after medical school. I'm not saying that this should be the decisive factor, but it certainly is something that you can and should consider. The cost of rent, food, and everything else is affected by the cost of living in a particular region of the country or area in which you live. It's just another item to consider when you're considering where to apply. Then there's the program focus and approach to medical education. Now, I talked a minute ago that schools are proud of the approach that they took, and they're going to be looking for people who want their approach. So again, for you as an applicant, you should also be choosing approaches that appeal to you. The very first, I think, decision that you have to make is, do you want to go to an MD or a DO program? And this is really basic. DO is not just an easier to get into alternative to MD or allopathic medicine, and it still allows you to be a doctor in practice, etc. It's a slightly different approach and more focused on primary care. So when you apply to DO schools, you will do much better if you show an interest, as in shadowing experience, in osteopathic medicine. Did you try it? Did you get some exposure to it? Or are you just using it as a backup in case you don't get into an allopathic medical school? The osteopathic schools aren't stupid, and they know the difference. So if you're serious about DO programs, make sure you try and shadow an osteopathic doctor or get some exposure to osteopathic medicine. Another very basic decision you have to decide to make is whether you want a school that has a research or a clinical focus. Now, some programs like Duke have a strong research orientation. They will want to see that you have done research as an undergrad or since college. For others, like SUNY Upstate or Zucker Hofstra, they appreciate the kind of intellectual rigor and mental training inherent in research, but it's clearly not a requirement to attend those programs. Not at all. That clinical exposure is, and it's, I think, I've never talked to a medical school admissions director who did not want to see clinical exposure in medical school applicants. But research is definitely optional at schools where that have a clinical focus. So you want to choose schools whose commitment to research matches your own. Now, another thing that you should look at, and again, I touched on this a minute ago, is where do grads of this medical school go into residency? Do they go into primary care or do they go into specializations? And if your preference is primary care, then you want to go to a medical school where most graduates go into primary care specialties. If you're thinking you want to be an orthopedic surgeon or a cardiologist or a neurologist or some much more specific specialty, first of all, which one? And are those the ones that the grads of the particular medical schools you're applying to tend to go into? Yes, I know you still might change your mind, and that's fine, 100% fine. But if this interest of yours continues throughout medical school, you'll be that much ahead of the game by having chosen a school that has a significant number of grads going in that direction. And again, it's one more way to show fit. And then again, I already mentioned pedagogical approach, right? Are you interested in problem-based learning, system-based learning, a combo of lecture and other approaches, team-based learning, no gross anatomy, or yes gross anatomy? What's important to you? What approach to medical education appeals to you? If you have a preference, that should figure into what schools you choose to apply to. There also has been a lot of change in terms of when medical schools incorporate clinical exposure into their curriculum. It used to be the first 2 years were lecture and classes, the second 2 years were in the wards. That's changed. More and more medical schools are introducing some clinical element to the first 2 years of their curriculum. If that's important to you, when do you want it to start? How much do you want to have? How do you want it to be structured? These are things, this is the curriculum. This is what you're going to be spending the next 4 years doing. You need to research it. You need to think about what you want. And then again, apply to those programs that have it. You'll be happier. You'll be better able to show fit, and you'll be better off. Now, choosing medical schools requires both soul searching to determine what's important to you. That's what we've just been talking about. And research into the schools to determine what's important to them and which schools have what's important to you. The self-reflection will determine what's important to you, as I just said. The research, which should include combing the school's websites, attending presentations, visiting schools when feasible, when they're in your geographic area, and connecting with current students and recent alumni, will enable you to assess what schools are looking for and which are appropriate for you, which are best for you. When you apply to schools where you are competitive and where you can demonstrate fit with their values and mission, you are increasing your chances of acceptance. It's just that simple. Again, it's as simple as that Venn diagram. I've just gone a little bit deeper with the most of the podcast. If you have questions on anything that I've talked about here or in this podcast, you can get answers by doing any or both of the following. 1, join us for ACE Your Med School application, a live Q&A with 3 med school admissions experts on March 12th. Reserve your seat at accepted.com/353 Q&A. There is no charge for the webinar. Or get answers from an experienced med school admissions consultant by purchasing an hour of consulting at accept.com/MEDAC, as in Med Admissions Consulting. Again, accept.com/MEDAC for an hour of admissions consulting where we can answer your questions one-on-one and really dive into what's important to you. Thank you very much for joining me for today's solo class on where to apply to medical school. This is Admission Straight Talk produced by Accepted, and I'm your host, Linda Abraham. I'll talk to you again next week.